today we're going to have a look at parallax scrolling, and I've chosen this because it was by far the most common thing that I saw in people's proposals that they wanted to implement. But whether or not you do plan on implementing this, it's still good to follow along because it explains some JavaScript concepts and some CSS concepts as well. So obviously if anyone else, as I keep saying, has any other things that you want me to do a tutorial on, then please just send me an email and I'll see what I can do, because I'll basically be directed by what people want in terms of the next few weeks. So I've got notes up in my usual place on my blog at dave.if90.net under DXB 301 tutorials and week 8, but it should also just be the first post on the home page as well. So parallax scrolling, or more generally parallax animation, most people have seen it and they understand what it looks like, but maybe it's worth breaking down a little bit what actually goes into building it up. So the most basic level, what it is you take a scene and you break up the visual elements of that scene into different depth planes. So you take like a foreground, a middle ground, and a background, and then you animate them at different rates to give the illusion of depth. So it's an animation technique that's been around for a long time, and Disney pioneered a lot of it. And I found this good video on YouTube that I think is as good an explanation as any. So I'm just going to run and play this now. And this will kind of explain the theory behind the technique.
Different kind of draw.
So that gives a reasonably good overview of what the whole technique's about. Essentially, you have the only thing you really need to remember is that stuff in the background moves slower than stuff in the foreground. And you'll notice that anytime you're in a train or driving a car, you look out the window, stuff that's close by whizzes past really, really quickly, but stuff that's far away almost seems not to move at all. So the only difference with parallax scrolling versus the parallax animation as it was shown there is that rather than the animation just being driven off a timer loop, as in like in the film, 24 frames per second, on the web page with scroll-based animation, it's the scrolling that's actually driving the animation. And so this is a technique that's become popular in recent years, and I've put a link to basically sites on the AWWW Awards website that are tagged as parallax. And a lot of you put really good examples of them in your project research as well. So now the technique does require JavaScript, but maybe not as much as you would think. Pretty much the movement of the stuff happens with CSS, but we need to use JavaScript for essentially two things. We need to use JavaScript because we need to respond to a user event in order to trigger the animation, that is the scrolling of the window. And we also use JavaScript to handle what we call the tweening in between the keyframes. So you can see when they were doing a frame-by-frame film, they'd move it, photograph each frame, and build up the animation like that, which is obviously very slow and tedious. But what we can do is basically say animate smoothly between this value and this value, and the JavaScript will handle that for us. Now, there's nothing to stop you from writing that JavaScript yourself, and I've linked to an article which shows you how you can do that. But there are many JavaScript libraries that exist that essentially do all of the heavy lifting for you. And there's a whole bunch of them. I spent quite a while going through a whole bunch of different ones before I decided on one to demonstrate for this tutorial. The one that I decided upon is called Scroller. And the reason I chose it is, while it's not necessarily the simplest one to get your head around, there are simpler ones. It's by far the most flexible, and a lot of the sites that you see with the really good examples, really complex examples of scroll-driven animation are made using that. So there are simpler ones, and obviously a quick Google search will show you a bunch of them. But generally the trade-off is the ones that are simpler to implement don't give you as much flexibility about how you can control it. So if you do want to be quite precise about where things appear at what point in the scrolling behavior, then something like scroll is quite good for that. So I'm going to show you an example. I've got the finished example which I've linked to here. Okay, and essentially it's a fairly simple page which has 3 different levels of depth. So in the most foreground layer we've got these large clouds, and in the middle ground layer there's the text, and that could be any other content we want. And then in the most background layer there's the sky color and those smaller background clouds. And you can see as we're scrolling, essentially the way that it gives the illusion of depth is that the things that are further away move more slowly than the things that are closer. So you can see the background layer moves most slowly, and then the middle layer moves a bit quicker, and then the frontmost layer, which is big clouds, moves the quickest. Okay, so essentially I've set this up pretty much the way that I've seen most people want to do something like this. When they talk about a single page parallax scrolling website, generally what you're wanting to do is present one section in the viewport at a time. So you present something, you parallax scroll down to the next section, you present something else, you parallax scroll down to the next section, you present something else. So at the moment I'm presenting the same content 3 times, but you could replace whatever content you want with this. So I'm going to demonstrate how I build up this example using the Scroller plugin, and then I'll also demonstrate how you can add navigation to smoothly scroll between the sections as well.
So really quickly,
yep.
If we were to do this and you just use a bunch of images and stuff like that, is it really difficult to put in text and stuff like that? And if we were to do this and we did it all like image-based, would we be marked down?
The technique's pretty much the same regardless of what content you use. So in this one, my only visual asset is this cloud.png file, and I've duplicated it a bunch of times to make up a bunch of clouds. But if you wanted, you could make, say, that whole background layer of clouds one image, and it's still, the div that contains is still the thing that needs to move. So I don't really mind how you end up implementing it, no. And this, so at the moment, this middle ground layer just has a heading 1 that says Parallax Scrolling, but you could put, I'll show you in the code where you put it, but yeah, you could put any other content you want on that layer. So the important thing though is that essentially you separate your layers into containers, and I'll use divs for those, and as long as those containers all align and they all start at the top here, then basically you can move them relative to each other. But I'll explain that as I sort of go along. So I've got the example files here that you can download. So I've got the finished version and also a stripped back version that has just the visual assets but none of the parallax stuff in it yet. So I'm going to open that, and I'm going to use this to demonstrate building up the example.
So are you recording this as well?
Yep. Should be. Yeah, I am. Okay, so let me pair this right back. Okay, now before I start, we should look at the Scroller library. So I've got a link here to the GitHub page where you can download the Scroller plugin, but I've also already got it included in the example files if you just wanted to take them and modifying it. So there's a lot of information here, and it can be quite overwhelming, but I'll point out the most relevant bits to our examples. But probably one thing I want to point out first of all is if the parallax animation is not exactly what you want, but you do want to do some sort of scroll-based animation, then Scroller is actually not specifically for parallax animation. It's pretty much any animation that's triggered by the scroll bar. So if you look at the examples, which I've got another link to here, and this one. Okay, so this is an overall page which shows a whole bunch of different stuff. Okay, so yes, there's parallax scrolling in the background, but you can animate all sorts of other things that aren't necessarily parallax, including changing colors and stuff like this. Okay, so there are a bunch of examples on this page, and I've linked to them from the blog post as well, right at the bottom here, to show you a bunch of other types of animation you can do. Okay, so things like drawing an SVG path triggered by the scroll bar. Okay, that's not parallax animation, but it's still scroll bar triggered animation.
Gradients is funny.
Sorry?
Gradients down the bottom.
This one?
Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, so there's all sorts of things that it can do, and it doesn't have to be parallax animation. It's basically any animation you want to do, but the trigger is scrolling. Now, one thing to note is that it is only vertically scrolling. It doesn't support horizontal scrolling. So if you wanted to do a horizontally scrolling thing, you'd have to look elsewhere or else modify this to get it working. You could probably capture the vertical scroll point and then plug that in, redirect it as a horizontal one, I imagine somehow. Okay, but most people are going to be doing vertical scrolling, so that's what we will look at. And the only other thing to note, the only other really new thing that's going to be in here is the way that we're going to make things move is going to be using Css3 Transforms. So it's not something that we've really covered specifically, but essentially it's just CSS styles, but what they do is these things here: translate, rotate, scale, skew, and do some sort of general matrix transform. If you've ever done anything with computer graphics, or it might seem familiar, but it's nothing too scary. Essentially, translate just means pan up and down, rotate means rotate, scale means go up and down, and skew is sort of squishing. So all the kind of things that you would do using something like the transform tool in Photoshop or something like that. Okay, you can apply those using CSS3 transformations. And so to do the movement, I'm going to use the translate CSS transform mostly. You could do it another way, changing the absolute offset in CSS and stuff. The reason that most people suggest that you use the CSS transforms is for performance reasons, basically. CSS transforms in browsers are hardware accelerated, so you get sort of smoother looking animation versus doing something like changing the the left and the top offsets, something like that. Okay, but other than that, there's not much to learn that's new, other than how you need to set things up to work with this scroller plugin. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the files. So I've got essentially in the download, I've got two folders here: build final and build start. Okay, and build start is just a stripped down version of build final. So I'm going to open up this example1.html. and I'll open it in the browser so we can see what it looks like without any of the parallax effects happening. Okay, so what I've got now is I've stripped it down to one pane, and I'll add the other ones, and I'm going to start with just two different depth layers, okay, and then we'll add the third one in later. So what I've got is the well, essentially I will have three, but I'm not going to do anything with the background. So that blue background moves at the same rate as the scroll bar. And what I want to do is move so the middle ground layer is where this heading 1 sits, okay, and it's going to move a bit faster than the speed of the scroll bar. And then I've got the clouds in the foreground, which is going to move a bit faster again. Okay, so let's see. So the way I've set this up, if I inspect the page here, and I look at the elements, okay, I've got my body, which I've styled with this background color, which is just a gradient from dark blue to a lighter blue, and I've set the color for the text to be this sort of darkish blue color as well. Then inside of that, I've got a div, and this is where I'm going to add sort of the different one-page sections. So I'm going to call them just section 1, section 2, section 3. But essentially, each section div is going to take up the full height and width of the viewport. So you'll notice the way that I've styled the section here is that the width is always 100%, and I've set the min height to this style here, which is 100 VH. So the VH is a newer unit in CSS, which stands for viewport height, and so 100 VH means make it 100% the height of the viewport. So what that means is, rather than setting it a specific pixel size, if I change the height of the viewport there, then that whole thing will shrink down. And again, the reason I've done that is because generally when people are doing parallax scrolling, they want sort of one section to take up the whole viewport at any given time. Okay, and then I've set the position of it relative so that the content within it I can set as position absolute, or sorry, the content within that as position absolute, and position that all on the same plane. So now if we take this section, the content within this section div is the stuff that I want to, where I want to set up my sort of foreground and background layers. So I've got the content div here, which you can see just contains my heading 1, but again this could contain whatever I want. And I've got my other div here, which is foreground clouds, which contains 1, 2, 3, and then a fourth cloud here, which is sort of off the bottom. So content and the clouds, they make up my two different planes that I'm going to move at different rates. And again, I've put these in as 4 different cloud spans, okay, and they just have this background image there of cloud, but I could have made that one giant picture that takes up the whole size, okay, so it can be whatever content I want inside there. Okay, so they're the things that we want to deal with in terms of moving them at different speeds. In terms of the CSS I've added, I've just included normalize.css, and then I've got a link to this example1.css file, okay, where I have some of those basic styles set. Okay, now in terms of JavaScript, I'm including my JavaScript files down here at the bottom. In terms of just using the scroller plugin, it doesn't actually require jQuery, but I've put jQuery in there because I use it for other stuff in a bit. But I've got the scroller plugin, the scroller JavaScript file, scroller.min.js. Okay, I've put all my JavaScript in a JS folder. So I've included that. And later on, when I do the menu, okay, the menu stuff has a separate scroller plugin file, so that's scroller.menu.min.js, and you can find the link on the scroller homepage where to get that. And then finally, I've got a link to my own JavaScript file, which is example1.js just here, okay, which at the moment is empty, doesn't contain anything. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is, well, let's jump back over to the scroller's documentation page. Okay, so essentially I've followed these steps so far. I've included the scroller min.js file, and then it tells me what I need to do is call this function called scroller.init. Okay, to make it all work. So I'm going to put that in my custom JavaScript file here, and I'm going to put this inside of a document.ready function, okay, to make sure it doesn't execute until the page is loaded. Okay, so we do that. Now, and that's pretty much all we have to do to get, that's all the JavaScript we really have to write to get this to work. Where we tell it how we want these different planes to animate is actually on the HTML attributes of the elements that we want to animate. Okay, and this is probably the most difficult part of this to get your head around, but I'll try and explain it as best I can, and if you've got any questions, by all means ask me. So essentially what you do is, there's a couple of ways you can define how the animation works. We'll start with the simplest way. Essentially what you do is you choose the thing that you want to animate. So let's take this heading 1, for example, and you tell Scroller the way that you want it to animate by using data attributes. So we can use one called data 0 equals something, and then data 500 equals something. Now, essentially what this is telling Scroller is you're setting up animation keyframes here. So what it's going to do is, and this number here represents the scroll offset from the top of the screen. So a number 0 here means that you're at the very top of the document, and 500 here means that you've scrolled 500 pixels down the document. Okay, and then what we put inside the string for these data attributes is any CSS style that we want to animate in between. Okay, so let's say we want to move this. Okay, let's say we want to move this in some direction. Okay, because it's a bit easier to see it working, what I'll do is animate it going left to right rather than up and down. So what I'm going to do is use the CSS here, which says transform. Okay, and translate. So the translate CSS property takes two values. Okay, it takes an X offset and a Y offset, so X being horizontal, Y being vertical. Okay, so what I'm going to say is at the 0 point of the scroll, then make my, well, let's just describe it in terms of how I want the animation to work. What I want to do is when I'm scroll down 500 pixels, or when I'm at the top, okay, I want this heading to just sit where it was. Okay, and as I scroll down, I want it to offset a certain amount to the left, let's say. So really at the 0 point of the scroll, I don't want it to do everything. I don't want it to do anything. At the 500 point of the scroll, I'm going to set transform, translate. Okay, and then I can offset it in any direction I want. So if I want it to move to the right, then I set the X translation to a certain offset. So let's say I want it to move 400 pixels. And even though I'm not moving it, when you call translate, you have to set both the X and the Y position. So I'll set the Y position to 0 pixels so it doesn't move. Now the other thing I have to do is, even though I'm not changing anything here, I have to set values for whatever I'm going to animate here. So what I can do here is I can tell it not to do anything by essentially saying translate 0 pixels and 0 pixels. Okay, so now if we take this as a whole thing, I've got two keyframes. One at the scroll position of 0, okay, which says translate nowhere, don't move it at all. And then by the time it gets to scroll position 500, then I'm going to translate this div, which contains my heading 1 content. I'm going to tell it to translate 400 pixels along the x-axis, so it should go 400 pixels towards the right, and don't change the y-axis at all. Okay, and Scroller will handle animating all the frames in between those 2 points. Okay, so we should see a smooth transition between the 0 point and the 500 point on the scroll bar.
So if you were to do it, if you wanted to just keep going like that, then you just do it the other way around. So you just put the values in the Y.
Yep, exactly. If you wanted to move it up, yep.
Cool.
Okay, so I will refresh this. Okay, and you can see here's, and if you look in the inspection tools, you can see where the JavaScript is actually modifying your code here. So there's the content div, which contains a heading 1, which is actually being moved. Okay, and you can see at the 0 point of the scroll, it's where I told it to be, okay, because it's got some margin there. And then as I scroll down, it moves along. So now, as you very rightly pointed out, if I want to move this in the other direction, okay, I can tell it to move 400 pixels. Okay, now if I put a positive value there, it's going to push it 400 pixels down. So what we'll find is that it moves in the opposite direction of the scroll. So what you end up getting is almost like you had that position fixed. Not quite, because 400 and 500 are different values. Okay, I'm scrolling down 500, but I'm offsetting at 400 pixels. So what we really want to do is, in order to get this parallax effect, we want to move it up slightly faster than it's being scrolled. So if we don't do any translation at all, if we keep these at 0 pixels, okay, then it will just scroll with its container. Okay, because this content div is contained within a section there, it's being scrolled anyway. So what we essentially want to do is translate it to push it a little bit higher than what it's already scrolling otherwise to give that parallax effect. So what I'm going to do is translate it by negative a certain amount on the x-axis, so let's say 400 pixels. Okay, and now you can see it disappears upwards quicker than the rate at which I'm scrolling. Alright, and so what I would do then to make these, the clouds, because they're even more in the foreground, I'd tell them to just disappear upwards at a quicker rate. Okay, so for the clouds, I'd offset them.
It actually makes so much sense.
Yeah, good. Okay, so for the clouds, and the reason I put all of these clouds inside of a container is because anything that's on the same plane I want to move at the same rate. Okay, so I could animate these clouds all separately, but if all I'm doing is animating the container, then I only have to write the values once and everything inside it gets shifted along. Okay, so you'll notice these clouds, I've just positioned them where I want to be at the start, and again I can copy these data attributes okay, and I'll put them on this foreground clouds, okay, and essentially that text was moving probably a little bit too fast, so I'll reduce that number there, and let's keep the clouds at say 400 pixels. Okay, so now refresh, and at 0 everything's translated by 0, 0, so it's no different than where I've originally put it. Okay, and as I scroll down, that text should move up by 100 pixels more than what the scroll is giving it, and the cloud should move up 400 pixels more than what the scroll is giving it. Okay, so that's how you get the parallax effect. And really, if you want to add more layers, it's just an extension of that. You just have to make sure the layers that are further back move more slowly than the layers that are further forward.
So do you have any tips for sort of working with multiple screen sizes so that hopefully the effects still look great?
Yep, so that leads me into my very next point. I'm glad you asked that question. Now, so what we've done so far is we've used absolute values for the scroll position here, okay, but we all know that when you change the size of stuff, okay, then the height's going to be different. So really, if we're talking about defining the size of all this stuff in terms of the viewport anyway, what we really want to do is define the scroll animation points in terms of the viewport as well. Because if the height of the viewport is more, then you'll see the effect ends up sort of looking less than if the viewport's really wide. It may not be super obvious there, but the effect ends up being different. The other thing is, if we then go and add another section here, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this whole section 1 and I'm going to copy that and name it section 2. Now I've got the 2 sections there, okay, but you'll notice that by the time I scroll down, and I've put a little faint border between them so you can see when the section reaches the top of the viewport. By the time I scroll down there, this is not where I want it to be, okay, because it's still being driven off the absolute value of this. So even though we can't see it down there, its animation is finishing by the time I've reached 500 pixels. So what we really want to do is be able to define where these animations start and finish in terms of when this container section sort of starts or enters and leaves the viewport. Okay, so that's the other way that we can define these keyframes. So if you look at the scroller documentation, it talks about absolute versus relative mode. Okay, and the relative mode is what I've used for the final example and is probably what's going to be more useful most of the time. But I decided to show the absolute mode first because it's a bit easier to understand in terms of where the scroll bar is versus what's happening. So the relative mode basically allows you to say, trigger the keyframes when a particular element is at some position in relation to the viewport. Okay, so what I'm going to do is strip back this section 2 and just go back to the section 1.
So the background picture there is the massive.
No, the background is just I've styled it as linear gradient.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah, so this so it's another CSS3 thing. You can have a linear gradient and just tell it doesn't matter how big it is, it will transition from one color to another color. Okay, so we've got just our section 1 now, and what I'll do is I'll make this do the same sort of thing, okay, but I'm going to, as much as possible, keep it relative to the viewport rather than by fixed pixel amounts. Okay, so this is probably the most confusing thing to get your head around as the way you define the relative mode data points, and you'll see that the syntax takes this form here. Okay, so basically we always start with data dash, okay, and then ignore that offset for a moment. Essentially you've got 2 positions here, okay, you've got the viewport anchor and the element anchor. So basically what you're saying is this keyframe is going to be active when this part of the viewport matches up with this part of the element that you're targeting. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, with this animation, if we think about where we want everything to be positioned, essentially I want everything to be positioned at its default values when the top of the section is aligned with the top of the viewport. Okay, and then I want it to complete its animation at the point where the bottom of the section, which is where this little line is here, if you can see it, okay, is aligned with the top of the viewport. So that's essentially the range of where I want the animation to have effect on each section is when it enters the viewport and when it leaves the viewport. So I have to do a couple of things well, I have to do one other thing first. So I'm going to add an extra data attribute to this, and just to make this a bit more readable, I'm going to put each of these on a different line, which is perfectly valid to do. Okay, but essentially this is my whole div tag, but I'm just putting each attribute on a different line. Now what I can do is when we're going to use the relative syntax for the keyframes, what you can do is you can say trigger this element but base it off the position of another element. So I want to trigger the animation of these elements based off the position of the entire section there. So to do that, I use, where is it here? It talks about here somewhere. Okay. Okay, so there's this attribute called data anchor target that Scroller will look for, and that basically says what do you want to trigger the animations. So in terms of this, I'm going to make my data anchor target equal, and then the way you define which element you want the data anchor target to be is by using a CSS selector. So I want this whole section div to be the thing which triggers where the animation starts and stops. So I'm going to use the CSS selector hash section 1 like that. And so now it's going to say animate this content based on the position of this section here. So once I've done that, I'm going to modify these attributes to no longer use absolute scroll positions, but offsets based on where this data target is in relation to the viewport. Okay, so at its most simplest, all we need to really keep in our minds is those two different things and where the alignment of those we want to be in order to trigger each of these particular keyframes. So if I'm thinking about, again, okay, my two keyframes being I want my animation to start there and finish when the bottom of that section is at the top of the viewport, okay, then that's my second keyframe. So what I need to do is give it two different positions, and the first one is going to refer to the viewport. Okay, so I'm going to say when the top of the viewport, okay, is aligned with, and then the next one is my data anchor. So when the top of the viewport is aligned with the top of my section, okay, and that gives me data top, then make the translation be nothing. Okay, and then, so that's my first keyframe. The second keyframe is going to be when the top of my viewport is aligned to the bottom of my section. Okay, so in this case I'm going to say data top of the viewport and bottom of the section. Okay, and in that case I'm going to move the this content div, okay, and I'm going to translate it by, again, a certain amount further up than it would already be by its scroll position. Now again, I've used pixels originally, but again, in order to make this move the same amount regardless, or the same percentage of the viewport regardless of how tall or short it is, okay, again, I'm going to specify the offsets not in pixel values, but in viewport height and viewport width units. Okay, so let's just say I want it to move 80% of the viewport height above where it would normally be. Let's pick something a bit more subtle. Let's pick 20. Then I'll say minus 20 viewport height units, which is essentially saying go 20% of the height further up than I would otherwise by scrolling. And now one thing that might trip you up when you start doing this is for scroller to work correctly and know correctly how to interpolate the animation between these points, you need to make sure that if you've got one type of units here for one keyframe, that you use the same type of units for another keyframe here. Okay, so I'm going to make sure that that's also 0 VH units. Okay, and they don't all have to be, as long as I mean, they're both the Y coordinate offsets. As long as they're both like that, then this should work. Okay, now I'm going to, let me just remove these ones from the clouds so that we can just see one thing working at a time. Okay, so just to recap this, what we've said now is that our data anchor target, or the thing that we want to align with the viewport in order to trigger our keyframes, is going to be this section 1 div. And I've given it 2 keyframes here. One where the top of the viewport is aligned with the top of that section. Translate it to do nothing. Okay, so everything just sits where I originally told it to. But then when the top of the viewport is aligned to the bottom of that section, so once it's scrolled up, okay, then translate it so that the Y position of this content is 20% of the viewport height further up the page than it would otherwise be just by scrolling it.
And are those top and bottom definitions already?
They're definitions basically that the scroller JavaScript library looks for. So you can see them. If you look in the documentation about where it talks about the absolute mode and the relative mode, okay, it shows you essentially all of those here. So the only extra thing that you might see is these offset values put in. So if you don't want things to be perfectly aligned, but you want to say, well, it's the top of this is within 100 pixels of the viewport, then you can add in this extra number here, which is essentially an offset to that. But in my example, I don't use that. I just say aligning the section with either the top or the bottom of the viewport, which I think is probably the most common way that people will want to do the animations. You start the animation as soon as it comes into view and finish it as soon as it's completely gone out of view. Yep.
How, you probably answered this eventually, but I just want to ask what's in my head. How far do you go with this? Like, how far would you go until you stop doing that and you give a mobile a different version? Like, you would put Parallax Scrolling on a mobile side, would you? There's certain things with mobile that actually makes stuff like this a bit of an issue. Because of the different, like, so much higher than this wire.
That as well, and there's also stuff like to save battery, they disable JavaScript while you're scrolling and stuff. So this plugin has ways of working around that, and there's instructions for that. But I would probably say if you're going to do both, Parallax Scrolling is probably inadvisable for a mobile screen. And because of what you said as well, because of the small screen size and stuff. But I think it's pretty rare that you'll find Parallax Scrolling done on a mobile thing. You mainly see it for big desktops, which is fine. I mean, if you're going to do Parallax Scrolling, I don't necessarily expect you to have it completely responsive and stuff. It's sort of a trade-off. You've got to, if you're going to have Parallax Scrolling, you've got to in some way accept that you're going to be limited in terms of your responsiveness and exactly where things tend to fit. But yeah, so it's something to be aware of. But yeah, if you're going to do Parallax Scrolling, if for your assignment, if you do Parallax Scrolling and you just do a desktop layout, then that's fine with me.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So let's see if this has actually worked. Yeah. Refresh. Okay, so the only thing we should see moving differently to the basic scroll is that text now. Okay, and then we can see it moving up. And so what this is doing, again, this is good to use the inspection tools because we can see when the animation starts and ends. is I'm scrolling, the animation is going, the animation is going, animation is still going even though it's off the screen, and it'll finish when the bottom of that section hits the top there. Okay, and I can't go any further anyway, but that's where it finishes. Okay, and you'll notice that the reverse direction is handled nicely already anyway. We don't have to do any weird handling on over reversing the direction of these animations. So, in order to do the clouds, essentially I'm going to do the same thing. Okay, I'm going to copy all of these, and here's my foreground clouds. Okay, and if I just copy those as is, they're going to move at the same rate. Okay, the text and the clouds move at the same rate as each other. What I want to do is offset the clouds by an amount greater than what I'm offsetting the text content. So let's make that, say, 80. Okay, and what this means now is, now that this is all done relative to the size of the viewport, if I change the size of it, okay, it'll readjust, and the animation, if I had done that in pixels, okay, 400 pixels would have been a greater percentage of the viewport height, so it would have looked like the animation would have gone too quickly. Everything would have disappeared off the top before I'd scrolled a certain amount. Okay, but what it also means is that now that I've set this up all nice and relative to the viewports, I can add another section just by duplicating it like this. Okay, and I'll rename that to section 1, and I'll tell the content and the foreground clouds to use their data target as section 2, and now without changing any of these other values, okay, we should see that this mostly works. There's still something that we need to change, but okay, you'll notice, okay, it gets to the top, and now the animation starts again. Okay, so the thing that we obviously need to fix here is that because this one, it always started at the top of the screen, okay, there's no chance for it to sort of appear from the bottom of the viewport. Whereas the next one, because it's got something above it, it does have that. But because we've only defined the first keyframe starting essentially when the top of the section aligns with the top of the viewport, it does nothing until then, it stays there. Okay, so...
You said it as like a negative value then?
Yep, absolutely nailed it in the head. So what we need to do is... sorry? Okay, so what we need to do is add another keyframe. So we've got the keyframes for this second one. First one starts there, okay, and ends when the bottom of that. I might just make that darker actually so it's easier to see. Okay, so it's easier to see where the sections start and end now. Okay, so the animation starts there, doesn't finish until there. Okay, so there's all of this basically from this point up until here where nothing's going on. So what I need to do is add another keyframe that essentially says when the top of this section 2 aligns with the bottom of the viewport, then, as you said, exactly, let's set the offset the other way. Okay, so I'm going to add another data attribute here. Okay, and so the order is viewport alignment, anchor alignment. Okay, so when I'm going to say now when the bottom of the viewport aligns with the top of this section 2, okay, then set the transform style to translate. Okay, and again I'm doing nothing with the X value, but the Y value, basically to make it even either side, I'm just going to set it to the positive opposite of what this value is here. Okay, so that's going to be 20 VH, and I'm going to do the same thing for the clouds.
think you're missing a closed parenthesis.
Yep.
Bracket.
Thanks. Okay, same thing for the clouds, but of the same amount there. Let's refresh that now. Now, as I scroll down, okay, you'll notice it scrolls into view, and at the point, I still get at the point where the top of the anchor matches the top of the section. Okay, you'll notice that's still translate 0. So it works out quite nicely. In terms of figuring out where things go, my suggestion is that you position everything where you want them to sit when the top of the section is aligned to the top of the viewport, right? And then you set the anchor point, the keyframes either side to be positive and minus offsets of those, and then they scroll in nicely. Okay, they animate the whole way, but they don't get to their correct position until essentially where you want them to be. Okay, so if you've got the user scrolling between sections of content, okay, they're not going to be reading necessarily the content here, okay, or here. They're going to be reading it here, especially if you've got navigation that animates in between. Okay, so that's where you want the alignment to kind of happen. Okay, and then we'll add a third section. Section 3. Make these both target section 3. Okay, now we're going to have to kind of do the opposite here. What we really need is similar to the top one, but we've only got 2 offsets, but it's a different offset. So we'll see what happens here. Okay, so here's my third section coming into view. Okay, and you'll notice that works, but then I keep going. I keep going further than what I need to go. So what I want to do is essentially that's as far as I want to go, that keyframe. So I've got where the section 3 aligns with the bottom of the viewport. Okay, so bottom of the viewport. Okay, so that one, I want to keep that one. I want to keep where section 3, where the viewport top matches the section top. Okay, so top. But the reason this keeps going further past there is because Scroll is adding extra space to let my keyframe come into view. So I've got this viewport top matching the section 3 bottom. Okay, so it's making space for me to be able to scroll down there. But really I don't need to scroll further because that's the end of the page. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take out this extraneous keyframe there, and out of the clouds as well. Okay, and now when I scroll down, okay, I only have the 2 keyframes. I've got when the section 3 top aligns with the viewport bottom, and I've got when the section 3 top aligns with the viewport top. Okay, and then it does go a little bit further here because the positioning of my clouds is offset. Okay, so when I position these clouds, they actually extend further down than the section there, so that it sort of comes in from the bottom as it's scrolling up. It's pretty easy for me to get rid of that just by going, well, on this third one I don't need that 4th cloud. It's never going to come into view. So what I'm going to do is grab that cloud there, that 4th cloud, just get rid of it. Okay, and now when I scroll down, it should stop nicely right at the bottom. Okay. Okay, so now I suppose what we can add to this now is an extra layer. So okay, so we've got the foreground clouds. I'm going to add this div with a class of background clouds. Okay. and in my CSS, okay, in my JavaScript. Now, again, this just goes to the same point of it doesn't really matter what content you put inside of these sort of plane containers, okay, the different depth planes. In the example as it is here, you can see I've physically written those 4 different cloud spans, okay. But what I'm going to do in the background clouds one, just for something different, is I'm going to use JavaScript to generate some of these spans and dynamically inject them in at random positions. Okay, so what I've got is a what I'm going to need is a for loop. Okay, and I'm going to make this loop run 20 times. So the loop's going to go from when I equals 1 to when I is less than or equal to 20. Okay, so it should run 20 times. Alright, now what I want to do is create a span node, and I'm going to use some jQuery for this. So I'm going to create a variable called cloud. I'm going to set that equal to okay, I'm going to use jQuery to create a span node that essentially looks like these same ones that I've used for the foreground clouds. Okay, and I'm going to give it the ID of, let's just say, let me just make sure I'm consistent with what I did in the final example. Okay, bg-cloud. Alright, and I'm going to use the value of I in this loop to essentially give each one a different span ID. So bg-cloud plus I, like that. Okay, and ultimately I'm going to want to append this new cloud to the where is it? Okay, to my background clouds div. Okay, so essentially what JavaScript's going to do is inject all of these spans inside of this div, okay, just like I have written in the HTML for the foreground clouds. Okay, so I will select that container div of background clouds and then tell it to append the cloud that I've just created. Okay, so before I go any further, I'm going to test that this has worked. Okay, so I can see there's the clouds that are being generated. Alright, there's my background clouds and there's the 20 spans that contain it. Only thing is I haven't put in any different position values for it. Okay, so they're all appearing one on top of the other. But at least I know it's adding them to my DOM now. Now the other thing I've noticed that I want to do is the background clouds. Okay, it doesn't have a. I haven't given it a position value. Okay, so what it's doing is it's sitting just below the content that's already there. So what I really want to do is make sure that background clouds has a position of absolute and a top value of 0. Okay, so that I can offset them all from the top. Okay, so what I really want to do is offset all of the clouds that are within that by a certain amount from the left and from the top, okay, so that they fill up the page. So I'm just going to go back in and make sure that this style here is now applied to that background clouds div. So I've got my CSS here, I've got my foreground clouds here, which you can see I've already set with a position of absolute, top 0. Okay, so background clouds is also going to have a position of absolute. I'm going to force the width to be 100% just to make sure that nothing gets sort of clipped. Width 100%, top 0. Okay, so this is one of the other things, I sort of did mention it briefly before, is that you'll notice each of my depth planes, I've all set them to position absolute with a top offset of 0. Okay, and that just makes it easy to, once they're all aligned, it's sort of the same thing. You can tell how much further each one's gone when you're moving them. Whereas if this one's already down there and that one's there, then the offsets are going to be a bit weird. Okay, so
is there a random function that you can
there is, which is exactly what I'm going to use. So to position my clouds, actually the other thing I'm going to do is okay, the other thing I'm going to do is, you'll notice in the final example my clouds are actually, my background level cloud is smaller. That's just another thing that's going to give it a more realistic illusion of depth. Okay, things that are further away are going to be smaller, given that they're the exact same cloud attribute, or the exact same cloud image. So I'm going to go back into my CSS here. Okay, and I've got this CSS definition for my regular foreground cloud. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, and that cloud class is also being applied to my background clouds. Okay, you can see I'm still giving it the class of cloud. But what I'm going to do is say, well, any cloud that is inside of the background clouds container, then I'm going to overwrite its width and its height. Okay, so again, the clouds I've set to be relative to the viewport in terms of their width and height. So when I shrink down the viewport, the clouds get smaller. And so all I'm going to do is I'm going to use these same values, but I'm going to essentially halve them. Okay, so, and I'm going to do it roughly. So I'll say 18% of the viewport width, and let's call this 10% of the viewport height. Now you'll also notice that now I've done these clouds as spans with a background image rather than image elements. There's no reason why you couldn't do it with image elements, but what this does mean is I can set this background size style to be contained, and what that means is that because the width and the height are being determined separately from the width and the height of the viewport, basically what contain says is we'll draw the box and keep it at its same height and width ratio, but just make it smaller. So doing this just stops it from distorting. Now again, that's neither here nor there really, because if you just wanted to create a separate background cloud picture and make it smaller, then that's fine. You wouldn't need to have to do this extra CSS stuff. Okay, so I've got my background clouds, which are identical to the foreground clouds, except they're just half the size. Okay, so, and there they are there. Okay, now half the size. So now we will go ahead and position them, and rather than writing out all the positions randomly, because there's going to be 20 of them, or sorry, rather than writing them all out manually, I'm going to use, as you suggested, a random function to generate a position for them. Okay, so to do this, I'm going to say, well, let's start with the width position. Okay, so I've got my cloud node here, all right, and I'm going to use the bit of jQuery that says cloud.css, and it's I already know it's positioned absolute. Okay, all of my clouds are positioned absolute, so I can give them a left offset of a certain amount, and that will push it over vertically. Okay, so, and the amount that I want to give it is something, and I want it to be again in viewport width units. So if I give it 0 viewport width units, okay, it'll be right over, it'll be the no offset from the left. If I give it 100 viewport width units, okay, then it's going to be completely over to the right. So essentially I want to create a random value that's somewhere between those two things. So what I can do is use a bit of JavaScript. I use the math class, and there's a function called math.random. And what that will do is it will give you a random number, a random decimal number between 0 and 1. And so if I want the 0 to 1 to map to a scale of 0 to 100, then I simply multiply it by 100. Okay, and then, so that will give me a number between 0 and 100, and then I will concatenate that with the string for viewport width. Okay, so now I should be able to see that work. Alright, and there you can see there's, and every time I refresh it, it's going to give me a slightly different arrangement, okay, because it's calculating a random value each time. So we've done that for the width. We can do the same thing for the height. So, or sorry, we've done that for the X offset, or the left offset. We can do it for the top offset as well, and we'll use the units of viewport height instead of viewport width. Okay, so now there I have a random arrangement of clouds for this. Now, if you didn't want it to be random each time, what you could do is a quicker way of doing this, but still having them hard-coded, is what I would do is I'd refresh this until I get a layout that I kind of like. All right, and then what you could do is go and simply grab them all from the DOM. Okay, there's my background clouds, and you could just right-click this and copy it. Okay, and then you could go into your HTML code and paste it there. Okay, so you could do that. That's, to me, that's still a quicker way of generating 20 different things with code. But anyway, I'm going to leave it as randomly generating. Now the other thing I'm going to do, I think in the final example you'll see I've slightly modified this. You'll notice that 0 puts it there, 100 puts it there, but actually if it's at 100 it can be sort of off the edge, and as well it can be off the bottom of the edge. Okay, so even though this one's top offset is probably like 99 point something, it puts the top of that there, and so it can still push out over. So all I've really done to modify that is, say, multiply it by 80 instead of 100. So now the maximum offset it can get is 80. Okay, and that sort of keeps it nicely, everything nicely contained within that section. Okay, now I can actually apply this really handily to all three of those sections just by, sorry, that's the final one, start one, just by grabbing this empty background clouds div. Actually, let's not do that yet. We'll animate this first. So, actually, no, I don't think I have it animated in the final example. No, I don't. So I will copy this over to final sections 2 and 3. Okay, and you'll notice that it applies the same positions to each of those sections, and the reason that is because via the magic of jQuery, okay, this selector here is actually selecting every instance of an element with the class of background clouds and appending that new cloud node to it. So for each one of these clouds that is being generated, it's actually being appended 3 times, okay, once to each of these different background cloud divs in sections 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so what we've essentially got here is, and actually the reason I added this background layer of clouds was because without them, it's actually difficult to see that the text content layer is animating any more slowly or any more quickly than the background. But once you've got these other clouds in the background, you can see. So really we still only have 3 different layers of sort of parallax here. It's just that the background clouds are going at the exact same speed as the sky background. Okay, I think the other thing I did in this example was I dropped the opacity of the background clouds a bit lower. Okay, so now that's pretty much all there is to it. The only other thing to say is just to reiterate that you don't just have to do parallax scrolling, okay? So again, you'll notice in the final example that I started doing some crazy animation on this here. So I can take any of these elements here. So to keep it consistent with the example, I'll stick with the heading or the text content here. Okay, and what I can do is I can, at the moment, all we've done is we've changed a single style for each of these. Okay, but there's nothing to stop you from adding multiple styles here. So this really is just going to be a bunch of CSS styles. So we can add more by separating these. So I can do a transform, and I can do a scale as well. So scale again takes 2 values for x and y. Essentially a scale of 1 means 100% scale, so keep it the same. And what I can do as well is, so let's see, that's when the top is the same as the top. So okay, so this top keyframe is my default one, so it makes sense. I want the scale to be 100% when it's perfectly aligned. Now, when the viewport is when the top of the viewport is at the bottom of the anchor, so when it's just starting to scroll in, what I'm going to do is make the scale transform scale. Okay, I'm going to make the scale 0. And then when it leaves, I'm going to make the scale let's say 5 times as big. Okay, and it will animate as many different values as you give it, as long as you've got them on all of your keyframes for whatever it is that's being animated. Okay, so I should be able to see this now. Now the animation will have already started, but okay, you can see that, okay, I've got it around the wrong way, but it starts off 5 times the scale. Okay, so the animation will start when the top of section 2 aligns with the bottom of the viewport, and then it will hit the keyframe to be 100%. That will be it. Okay, so I'll just switch these. Yeah. So I'll switch those around, so it should be the right way now. Okay, so we can see that's where the animation will start at 0 scale. By the time they align, that's 100% of the scale, and then it continues going to that point where it will be 5 times the scale. Okay, and so you can combine any number of those that you want. You see, I think I've got the clouds going left to right and stuff. But as you can see in the examples, you can also do colors and rotation, all sorts of stuff like that. So you could, if you want, simulate parallax on the sort of depth axis by, rather than translating all the layers, rather than doing that, you scale the layers, but you scale them at different rates. Okay, so the frontmost thing scales quicker than the further back layers. So that's pretty much all the parallax stuff. Anything else you do is an extension of that, and you can pretty much animate any CSS property this way, including colors. The only thing I think it says with colors is that you have to define them as RGB rather than hex colors. And then that's the only thing. So the only other thing I want to add to this is how we can do the menu navigation. So I'll grab the HTML code from the complete example. So I'm going to chuck the navigation up the top here. It's just an unordered list. List items and anchors, and the href should just match the ID of the section. Okay, so section 1, section 2, section 3, like that. Okay, so now without doing anything else, or without putting in the scroller plugin, okay, it actually does jump. Even though some of the animation still happens, it is jumping between sections there. So to get a nice smooth sort of scroll between sections, what you do is we need this scroller.menu.min plugin, which you can find. Okay, it talks about hash navigation here. It links you to a separate thing here, but it's just this JavaScript file here. So I've included that down here, scroller.menu.min, immediately after the scroller JavaScript file.
And that just handles menu interactions?
Yep. So that purely handles menu interactions. So I'll just also copy across the styles for my menu. Okay, so I've just styled my menu so that the position remains fixed, so it's always there, and there's no list bullets, and they're just it's just got some padding and background color on hover. Okay, so to make it smoothly scroll rather than jump to each different point, pretty much you just follow the instructions on here. Okay, so as the documentation, there's the scroller.init that you have to do obviously first, and then there's scroller.menu.init, and then you pass it. You need to pass it for whatever reason a reference to the scroller object that you've initialized, so that's where that S comes in there. And then you can optionally pass it a object with a bunch of things that customizes the way that it works. But actually you can get it to work in its most simple way with its default settings just by doing scroller.menu.init. Okay, I'm going to pass it this scroller object that was created when I used scroller.init, and then you can actually just pass it an empty object and it will use all of its default settings. Okay, so we should be able to see this work now. So when I click on this, okay, it was at the middle one already. Okay, so section 1, scroll to section 2, scroll to section 3, and you can see each of the animations still works.
Now, would you suggest using this as opposed to like a smooth scroll plugin?
You could if you used a separate scroll to plugin, I actually think it would work the same way, because all you'd be doing with like another scroll to plugin would be triggering the scroll, so it would probably work. The only other thing that this lets you do is it takes care of like changing the hash in the URL as well. So you can I can actually refresh this page, or so we go to number 2, and I can open this page in another tab with that URL, and it will start at 2. So that handles that kind of nicely for you. I suppose I would say if you're using if you're using the scroller plugin already, that's probably the best integrated one. But if you weren't using scroller and you just wanted that, it is probably be easier to implement with a separate scroll navigation plugin. Let's see what else. So in terms of customizing the way that works, probably the only thing you'll really want to customize is the duration of that scroll. And the way you do that is by, and you can see it in the documentation here, you put a you put inside the object that you're passing to the initialization of the scroller menu, you pass a property called duration, which defines a function here, returns a value. The default is 500 milliseconds. So if you want to change that, let's change it to say 2 seconds, 2000 milliseconds. Just modify that number there. And then it should take that much time. So that, I guess, a little bit of a longer duration lets you see the animation a bit better. Okay, but you don't want to make it too long for, you don't want to make your users wait too long. Probably something around a second's kind of, wouldn't want to go much longer than that. But the default at 500 milliseconds is okay too, which, as I said, you just pass it a empty object and it will do that as the defaults. Oops, broke something. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Yeah, and as I said, it doesn't have to be parallax animation. You can use that to drive any animation based off the scroll bar. Any questions?
I will have them eventually.
Okay, so there's the example files there, including the finished version. So if you're doing something like this, and you want to use this as a starting point, I'm happy for you to do that. I've got links to where you can obtain all of these, but it's essentially just jQuery, and then the scroller page has the scroller and the scroller menu one, and then that's it. They're the only extra plugins I used. All right.